A burning red light appeared in the evening sky over the desert landscape, catching my attention. It was a signal flare. Although a flare was a quick way to start a wildfire out in the desert shrubland we found ourselves in, it was also a good way for some poor hiker or camper, their cell phone certainly without connection this far out, to signal for attention if they were lost, injured, or in need of help. I quickly called out on my radio, reporting the sighting and general area the flare had come from to an intern at the main office, and advised I would check it out. An hour later, around the rocky hills and past the narrow gorge, I found the man that had fired the flare gun. The sight of him left me in shock. A 20-year-old man, he looked 10 years older after his time in the sun and heat, dirty and sunburnt. His clothes were ragged, his lips were chapped, cracked, and bloodied, and the skin on his face and arms was red and peeling. But his condition wasn't what shocked me. We were in the desert, and I had seen plenty of visitors that didn't get lost or injured, but still came away from their trips looking like him. What shocked me was that I recognized him. He was a hiker that had gone missing, and I had been part of the large search party that had tried to find him. Except, he had gone missing 30 miles away from where he currently stood, and had been missing for 3 months. The surprised look on my face didn't stop the young man from practically throwing himself at me in a hug, and even though he seemed deeply dehydrated, I saw tears of relief streaming down his cheeks when he looked up at me. I quickly handed him my canteen as I introduced myself, and he gulped down the water in a flash. When I reached a hand down for my radio to report what I had found and call for help, he interrupted me, trying to return the empty canteen with a shaking hand as he pleaded, "Please, get me out of here before it finds me." My hand stopped where it was as I eyed the man. He had been missing in the desert for 3 months, and while he was obviously in poor condition, he was neither dead nor dying. Either he had been hiding somewhere with access to food and water for 3 months, or... I asked him if someone had kidnapped him. He shuddered before replying. "Not who," he said. "What?" The answer got my attention, and I felt a pit form in my stomach. I had a suspicion that I already knew what had happened to him. I told him to explain it to me as I retraced my steps, guiding us back in the direction I had come from. What he told me was ludicrous, and he must have known that there was no way I would believe it, but the words came spilling out of him once he got started. As he walked on a trail in the evening, heading back to where he had parked, something had grabbed him from behind and yanked him into the brush, dragging and carrying him until he hit his head, losing consciousness. When he woke up, he found himself in a cave, and in the light coming from the mouth of that cave, he realized he had been lying on a leg, the leg of a monster. I tried not to wince as I heard him describe her. He said it was tall and slender, skeletal in some places, but mostly willowy and long. The skin was black and discolored, as if it had been frostbitten all over its body. Its fingers were bony, but their grip was strong. 2 horns grew from its head, twisted and curved, like the horns of a ram. Dirty frayed hair draped over most of its face, but he could often see its mouth, and in the mouth were crooked, rotted teeth, and the stench from its breath was foul, causing him to retch. I shuddered, but he failed to notice, and continued to speak as we walked around the rocky hill. He said that it kept him there in the cave ever since it took him. At night, it would go out, and would return before daylight with cactus fruit and raw meat and fresh blood, and it would coerce him to eat it all. And during the day, it would force him to lie next to it as it ran its fingers through his hair, or pinched at his skin hard enough to draw blood, or as it would grab him by his cheeks and force him to look at its covered face as it exhaled its fetid breath directly into his nose. When he worked up the courage, he tried to run away at night when it was out, but it caught him almost immediately and dragged him back to the cave and punished him. He actually used that word, punished. I saw him reach up and touch his chest, and I could only imagine the scars she had etched into his flesh with her sharp nails. He shook his head and continued. He explained that, after his attempt to escape, when it would go out at night, it started to bring back more than food. It would return with random items and trinkets, from colorful stones to polished bones to a crudely made dream catcher. I bit my lip to keep quiet as I realized she had been bringing him gifts. But some of the things it brought him had been taken from people. Sleeping bags, jackets, a tin mess kit, a smashed cell phone, and a bag. And then he said that the bag it had brought back from a few nights earlier had a flare gun and some flares in it. And so, when I tried to sit him down next to it that morning, he had aimed the loaded flare gun directly at its face and pulled the trigger. He hadn't stayed behind to see its full effect, but he was certain the flare had ignited its hair, and even if it wasn't dead, it must have been too hurt to hunt for him. Hearing that filled me with a sense of dread. But he knew it would be night soon, so he wanted to get out of the wilderness before it could potentially start tracking him, especially since he had just used his last flare to signal for help. As we passed by the gorge, he asked me if I believed him, or if I thought he was crazy. I stopped in my tracks and, looking at the rocky hills, replied that whether I believed him or not, it sounded like he had managed to injure her pretty badly. I saw him from the corner of my eye nod slowly, before turning to look at me and asking, "What do you mean, her?" I spun around and, with a quick shove, pushed him off the edge of the gorge, listened to his scream, and watched him fall 20 feet before landing on his back in a large, thorny desert bush. I heard him cough and sputter and moan, and while the fall hadn't been enough to kill him, it had been enough to temporarily immobilize him. Temporary was all that I needed, because the sun had gone down enough, and the gorge had gotten dark enough, and I saw her for the second time in my life. She crawled out of a crevice in the wall of the gorge, pouring her body out of the hole and unfolding into her true, terrifying height. I was farther from her than the last time I had seen her, but far closer than I ever wanted to be in my life again. She was still just as long and skeletal and black and putrid as I remembered, but I could see that her hair had been burned, and her mangled face was open to the world. She didn't even acknowledge me, keeping her eyes on the man now lying in the thorn bush, and one could mistake the expression on her face as that of cold fury. I knew better, though. It was the pained look of betrayal. She lifted the man up by his arm as he began to scream, and slung his body over her shoulder as she took impossibly long strides deeper into the shadows. But before she vanished from my sight, I saw her turn to look at me, her cold eyes appraising my own, and I held my breath in fear, reaching up to touch my chest. I remembered the last time I had seen her, when I had tried to rescue the prior man she had collected. She hadn't taken kindly to that, and the scars of her punishment were still etched into my skin. The moment passed, and she looked away, continuing her walk back to her home with her prize, as I allowed myself to breathe once more. She must have known I would never impede her again. A few minutes later, I radioed back to the main office and let them know it had been nothing but a hiker messing around off the trail. I spared one glance in the direction she had taken the man, pitying the punishment she was sure to inflict on him that night, before turning to get back to the trail and away from where that signal flare had lit up the evening sky.